Here's an important point about the supercharger installation. Earlier we said you had to have a socket with a swivel and a 12mm. Well, it won't be enough to just use a swivel that you add a socket to. You actually have to have a true swivel socket with the socket part of the swivel in order to reach and access the bolts to bolt in the supercharger. Upon removal, you can get away with a swivel and a socket, but on installation you have to have a swivel socket itself, and that's a 12mm. For the sake of showing you something about the factory intake manifold, we've put some of the parts back on that we removed earlier. This is the ACIS valve. This is for the acoustic control induction system on the factory intake. It's actually not used on the supercharger system, so you won't be using that connector or the valve. This is the purge valve for VSC, and this is the vent hose. The bolts for the purge valve and the vent hose are different lengths. Toyota says to inspect the lengths and compare. Whatever one is the longest is the one that you use to reattach the purge valve back onto the supercharger. The new TRD supplied fuel injectors have a shorter nose than the original injectors, but they'll definitely supply more fuel that's needed for more horsepower. You apply lube to the O-ring on the top of each injector, connect the harness to each injector, and install the injectors in the fuel delivery pipe. Make sure there's no scratches or foreign matter in or around the insertion hole of the delivery pipe. And when inserting the injectors, be careful not to damage the O-ring. To install the fuel delivery pipes in the engine, you need to make sure that the 2 delivery pipe spacers and the 4 insulators are in place in each cylinder head. Also, that the inner diameter of the head is lubricated. Install the bolts, torque them to spec, then connect your wire harnesses and fuel line connectors. Since the throttle body is now installed 180 degrees out of stock position, the throttle body connector will no longer reach. So Toyota says to separate the throttle body wiring and use the supplied piece of loom to cover the wires, tape it up correctly, and then the throttle body connector will reach. We've got the new serpentine belt installed on the engine, and the fan and shroud are back in place as well. Now Toyota says when you remove the upper radiator hose, you want to mark it, the end that goes to the radiator, so you know to put it inverted when you put it back together. But if you forgot to mark it, it's okay. The radiator hose has a white mark on the radiator side and a yellow mark on the engine side, so just remember to put the white mark towards the engine. After you get that installed, it's time to move on to replacing the spark plugs. Nice. Okay, the spark plugs are installed. We've put on the vent hose. We had to modify this vent hose. We've installed the airbox cover and the bellows. The mass airflow sensors installed. Now we want to move on to the intercooler installation. The first step is to remove the horn and the upper bumper retainer. With the bumper retainer removed, it's time to install the intercooler pump to the bracket. It comes with these clamps, but you need to make sure that the outlet of the pump is at about a 30-degree angle to the bracket. Next, you need to remove the side deflector from the radiator. This is the left-hand side, and you have to cut a piece off to modify it so the intercooler hoses can pass through up into the engine compartment. If your vehicle has a towing package, you have to remove the transmission oil cooler. If it doesn't have a towing package, you have to remove the right side deflector for the radiator and modify it for hoses to pass through. On a vehicle with an oil cooler, there's already room for the oil cooler lines to pass through, so you don't have to make this mod. You know, of all the custom work that I've ever done, one thing I really appreciate is a well-engineered kit. Toyota went out of their way to utilize factory bolt holes whenever possible to make this install kit look as seamless as possible. You know, it essentially looks like something that Toyota engineered from the start, and I have an inclination that they did when I was at the SEMA convention in 2006. Before these trucks were even released, I saw this supercharger kit on a truck. You can find pictures of it online. So they've had quite a while to engineer this thing up and make sure that it was going to work and look the way they wanted it to. You put this radiator support bracket back on, and it provides you with a place to put the low temperature radiator pump in, which is right about here. It slides in behind the bracket, and Toyota provides bolts when necessary, like this 20mm bolt right here to go into the front of the bumper support. Now after I get this thing bolted in place, I need to install the reservoir under the hood next to the radiator, and then we're going to route all the hoses that are provided for running coolant through the low temperature radiator up into the intercooler for the air to water intercooler action to take place. After that, it's time to move on to the new fuel pump. Alright, that was the last electrical connector for the intercooler system. The piping's done, the electrical's done. Next, we have to get to the fuel tank, drop it down, and install the new fuel pump. All the pipes that are connected to the fuel tank have to be disconnected up here. We're going to use a mission jack, lower the tank down, and put the new fuel pump in. Then, all we've got to do is flash the computer. Obviously, if you don't have a lift and a mission jack, you could do this on the ground. You just need to use a couple of floor jacks and a piece of wood to keep the tank level. Fuel tank's out of the truck. It's time to replace the fuel pump. We actually have to disassemble the assembly here that has the sending unit and the pump in it to replace just the pump. Now the instructions say you have to have a special tool to remove this ring that holds the pump assembly in place. But if you got a set of these and you're careful, you can remove it with these. When removing the fuel pump retainer ring, you need to manually push the clips out of the way when they come around. Eventually the ring gets to a height where they're no longer in the way. Disconnect the fuel gauge connector and disconnect the fuel pump connector. Press down on the sender gauge claw and slide the sender gauge upward to remove. Disconnect the tube from the two clamps. Detach the claw at the end of the tube. Detach the 3 claws on the spring assembly. Detach the 2 claws from the pump cradle and remove the sub-tank. Detach the 5 claws on the fuel pump and disconnect the pump from the suction plate with filter. Remove the O-ring and spacer from the fuel pump, then disconnect the fuel pump harness from the pump. Install the spacer and O-ring onto the new fuel pump. Continue installing the new fuel pump into the pump assembly in the exact opposite order used to remove the pump. The new fuel pump is a Toyota original equipment pump from a different application that directly replaces the existing pump. Fuel pressure remains unchanged from the original specification. For reinstallation of the fuel pump assembly, you want to make sure you use the new O-ring included in the kit. The old O-ring's junk, so don't worry about that one. You take the new O-ring, put it in place, and make sure you use some sort of lubricant. You can even dip it in gasoline if you choose. We're using Silglide for this application. So make sure you have a nice liberal amount of lubricant. That way when you tighten up the assembly, the gasket doesn't bow over or buckle over, because if it does, you'll end up with a code for a leak. You want to position the assembly back into the tank carefully, not to damage the sending unit. And there's a notch to determine the clock position. Okay, we've put the fuel tank back in the truck. We've filled up the cooling system with coolant. We've also purged all of the air out of the intercooler system, and we've reconnected the battery. Now it's time to flash the computer. I've got technician from Toyota, Don Courtney, here to help us do the flash. Appreciate it, Don.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get this started. I want to see this thing on the road.
Well, we're going to hit next.
Well, that's everything you need to know about installing a supercharger in a 5.7 Tundra. If you like that, stay tuned to our videos. We'll have a lot more coming where that came from. And once you get one of these installed, trust me, it's a whole lot of fun.